I remember the first time she said that. Not because of the words themselves, but because of the way her voice folded into the quiet around us, as if the room leaned closer to listen. It was late, and the shop had technically closed an hour earlier. I should have been locking up, but the fluorescent lights above the counter hummed on, and I stayed, sorting through bolts and washers I didn't really need to count. She stood on the other side of the counter, holding her receipt like it was an afterthought. She wasn't supposed to be there anymore. Customers usually left the moment I told them we were closing. But she lingered. She always lingered. Her hair was tied back in a way that made her seem like she didn't care if it fell loose. Mid-40s, maybe, though I never guessed out loud. She carried herself with the kind of ease that came from surviving more years than me, more mistakes too. And yet, there was something about her stillness that made me restless. I'd fixed the hinge on her old desk lamp the week before, and since then she'd found reasons to return. Screws for a bookshelf, oil for a stubborn drawer, a measuring tape she didn't really need. I should have asked her why. I never did. Instead, I watched her trace the counter with her fingers as though memorizing the scratches in the wood. I asked if she wanted a bag for her things. She shook her head, eyes lifting to mine, and for a second the air between us turned heavy. Not suffocating, more like standing too close to a fire you didn't know you needed. That's when she said it. "You'll forget me one day." Not a question, a statement. I laughed, though it came out thinner than I meant. Not even in my dreams. She didn't laugh back. Her lips pressed together, as though my answer had stepped into a room she'd kept locked. The silence that followed stretched, longer than it should have, until the hum of the lights became unbearable. I shifted, wiping my hands on the rag I always kept in my back pocket. She tilted her head like she wanted to speak, but didn't. I looked away first. My father used to say the one who looks away first is the one who feels more. I'm not sure if he meant that as a warning or a blessing. She tucked the receipt into her pocket and slid the small box of screws closer to herself. Her fingers brushed the counter again, softer this time, as if saying goodbye without words. "Thanks," she said finally, but it sounded unfinished. I nodded. My throat had gone dry, like I'd swallowed dust. She turned to leave, and I told myself not to watch her walk to the door. Of course, I did anyway. Her coat shifted with each step, catching the low light, and I wondered if she always walked like that, steady, measured, or if it was just because she knew I was watching. The bell above the door gave a hollow chime when she left. I stood in the empty shop, listening to its echo fade into nothing. I should have gone back to counting bolts. I should have turned off the lights. But I just stood there, staring at the counter where her hand had rested. That night, when I finally closed my eyes, it wasn't the screws or the receipts I thought about. It was the sound of her voice and the strange certainty in the way she said I would forget her. And the truth was, I already knew she was wrong. She came back 3 days later. This time it wasn't screws or oil. It was a chair leg she carried in like an unwanted secret. The wood was cracked clean through, splintering at the edges. She set it on the counter as though it weighed more than it should. "Think you can fix this?" she asked. Her tone was casual, but her eyes stayed on the leg, not on me. I turned the piece over in my hands, running a thumb along the break. "Yeah, might take a little glue and a clamp. Could show you how." She hesitated, barely, but I caught it. A flicker in her face, a pause in her breath. Then she shook her head, like she'd just reminded herself of something. "Better if you do it. Less chance of me making a mess." She tried to laugh at her own words, but it didn't land right. I wanted to say something back, something light, to ease the weight she carried in her voice. Instead, I just nodded and set the chair leg aside, promising it would be ready in a day or two. She didn't leave, though. She stood there, tracing the rim of the counter again, the same way she had before. I wiped my palms on the rag in my pocket and forced myself not to stare. "You always stay this late?" she asked. "Only when people bring me broken things." This time, she did laugh, soft, brief, but real. I felt it settle into the room like warmth. I leaned against the counter, pretending to study the chair leg, but my eyes kept flicking to her hands. The knuckles were faintly red, like she'd been carrying something too heavy earlier or gripping tighter than she meant to. Her nails were short, uneven at the edges. beautiful in a way that didn't try to be. She noticed me noticing. Her fingers curled into her palm, almost shyly, and she tucked both hands into the pockets of her coat. The sudden guard in her posture told me I had stepped into a part of her she didn't show easily. The quiet between us stretched again. Not awkward exactly. More like something alive, something neither of us wanted to disturb. "You look tired," I said, before I could stop myself. Her head lifted, surprised. "That obvious?" I shrugged, softer than I felt. "Not obvious. Just, I notice." She didn't answer right away. Instead, she exhaled through her nose, the kind of breath people let out when they've been holding too much. Then she gave me a small smile that didn't quite hide the weariness in her eyes. "Careful," she said. "Noticing things can get you into trouble." The words should have been teasing, but her voice carried something else, something sharper, almost like warning. I didn't reply. I just held her gaze a little longer than I should have, until she finally looked away. When she did, it felt like the whole room leaned with her, following the shift of her silence. And for reasons I couldn't explain, that small moment, her laugh, her tired eyes, her guarded hands, stayed with me long after she was gone. The rain came down harder than the forecast promised. I'd stayed late at the shop, finishing up a few repairs, when I heard the bell above the door. It was her. She shook the water from her coat, muttering something about not trusting the weather. Her hair was damp around her face, strands catching the dim light. She looked younger and older at the same time, unguarded in a way I hadn't seen before. "I didn't mean to intrude," she said, "but I was passing by. Thought maybe the chair leg was ready." It was. I'd finished it earlier that afternoon. I slid it across the counter, careful not to make too much of it. All fixed. Stronger than before, actually. Her hand brushed mine when she reached for it. Not on purpose. Just the clumsy kind of touch that should mean nothing. But it froze me where I stood. For a second, neither of us moved. Outside, thunder rolled, low and heavy. She glanced at the door, then back at me. "Maybe I'll wait until the rain slows," she murmured, already pulling the chair leg closer to her, as if it offered some excuse to linger. I nodded, too quickly. "Yeah, of course." The shop felt smaller with her inside. The ticking clock on the wall sounded louder, the hum of the fluorescent lights sharper. She set the chair leg aside and perched lightly on the stool by the counter, crossing one leg over the other. We talked, about nothing mostly. The storm, the town, books she'd read that I hadn't heard of. She spoke with pauses, with glances that slid away when they lingered too long. I found myself studying the faint crease at the corner of her mouth when she smiled, the way her voice softened when she admitted she hated sleeping through storms. I almost told her something then, something reckless about how I wanted her to stay, how I liked the way her presence filled the room. But before the words could form, her phone buzzed against the counter. She flinched. The screen lit up with a name I didn't recognize, but her eyes tightened before she pressed the phone face down and silenced it. "Sorry," she said, too quickly. I wanted to ask who it was, why it made her voice sound suddenly thin, but I didn't. Instead, I leaned back, gripping the edge of the counter to keep my hand steady. The silence stretched again. The storm rattled the windows. Her eyes flicked to mine, searching for something I wasn't sure I could give. For a heartbeat. It felt like we were both leaning into the same unspoken gravity. Her hand twitched, as though she might reach across the counter. And I almost, let mine move toward hers. But the storm cracked louder, the kind of thunder that makes everything jump. She pulled her hands back to her lap, laughing softly, nervously, like she needed to cover something. I laughed too, though it came out hollow. The moment slipped away, fragile as glass. And I've been carrying the sound of that almost laughter ever since. The storm passed, but something between us hadn't. She came by the shop again the next week. Not with anything broken, just herself. Said she wanted to return the clamp I'd lent her for the chair leg, though she could have easily kept it. She placed it on the counter like an offering, then didn't step away. We ended up sitting in the back room, the one with the single hanging bulb and shelves stacked with half-forgotten parts. The air smelled faintly of dust and oil, the kind of smell that seeps into your clothes. She sat on a wooden stool, elbows resting on her knees. I leaned against the workbench, trying to look busy, though my hands weren't steady. For a long time, neither of us spoke. She was the one to break it. Her voice was quiet, but not soft. More like a blade laid carefully on the table. What are we doing? I froze. The wrench in my hand suddenly felt ridiculous, like a child's toy. I don't know, I admitted, though the words caught in my throat. Her eyes stayed fixed on the floor, but I could see the tension in her jaw. You're too young. And she trailed off, shaking her head. I shouldn't even be here. I wanted to argue, to tell her that age wasn't the thing she thought it was. But the words felt too big, too clumsy. So I stayed quiet, listening to the faint hum of the bulb above us. Finally, she looked up. Her eyes met mine, and it felt like something inside me shifted. You don't understand. People like me, we don't get second chances. Her voice cracked on the last word, so softly it might have been a trick of the room. I swallowed hard. Then why come back? Her lips pressed together, the silence between us turning heavier than any words could hold. The bulb buzzed overhead. My hand tightened around the wrench, knuckles widening. She leaned back, exhaling as if she'd been holding her breath since the day we met. Because when I'm here, she said slowly, I forget how tired I am. The words sat in the air, raw and unpolished, vibrating in the silence. I wanted to reach for her, to do something, anything, that would ease the weight she carried. But I stayed against the workbench, too afraid to break whatever fragile truth she had just handed me. We stared at each other for a long time, no shield left between us. Her hand lifted slightly, then fell back to her lap. My mouth opened, closed again. The silence stretched, alive with everything neither of us could say. Finally, she whispered, almost to herself, and that's the worst part. I don't want to remember what I was like before. The line cut through me sharper than thunder ever had. And in that moment, I knew it happened on a Tuesday, the kind of day where nothing should matter. The shop was quiet, the afternoon slow. She came in carrying a bag, said she had something for me. It's nothing, really, she murmured, setting it on the counter. Inside was a tin of cookies, uneven and a little burned on the edges. She smiled like she wanted to apologize for them. I don't bake often. Just thought you might want something homemade. I should have just thanked her. Instead, I asked why. Her face shifted. The smile faltered, then returned, smaller, more careful. Because I didn't last time. I didn't understand what she meant. Not until she reached into her coat pocket and slid a folded photograph across the counter. It was worn, the corners soft from years of being touched. A man stood beside her in the picture, maybe mid-30s, arm wrapped loosely around her shoulders. He looked familiar in a way I couldn't place. His eyes, his crooked grin, there was something about him that echoed. She paused, staring at the photo like it belonged to someone else. My husband. The word felt heavy in the small space. I nodded slowly, waiting for her to go on. He died 12 years ago. Car accident. One of those random things you never think will touch your life until it does. She swallowed, voice breaking slightly before she steadied it. He used to come in here. Not this shop, but the old one before you worked here. Always had something broken he couldn't fix himself. I didn't breathe. My chest felt caught between recognition and silence. She glanced at me, almost apologetic. You remind me of him sometimes. The way you stand there, rag in your pocket, trying not to say more than you should. The air shifted in me. Something that had felt only mine suddenly wasn't. I was standing in the shadow of someone I never met. Someone who had already written himself into her life long before I arrived. I'm not him, I said quietly. I know. Her eyes softened, though her hands tightened around the edge of the counter. That's the problem. For a moment, neither of us moved. The cookies sat forgotten, the photograph a quiet weight between us. I wanted to tell her I wasn't trying to replace anyone, that I didn't even know how to. But my voice refused to carry it. Instead, I reached out, touching the corner of the photo with my fingertips, just enough to feel the worn paper. Her hand hovered nearby, close enough that if either of us moved an inch, we'd touch. But we didn't. The silence settled like dust, but it wasn't empty. It was filled with something raw, something irreversible. She whispered then, barely audible, as though afraid the walls might hear. I don't know if I'm keeping you close because of who you are or because of who you're not. And I knew, with a quiet certainty, that nothing in me would ever be the same again. Nothing between us could ever go back to being ordinary. She came by after closing, when the shop was nothing but shadows and the smell of old wood. I hadn't expected her, but I didn't send her away either. She walked in slowly, as though testing the floorboards, her coat draped over one arm. No excuse this time. No broken chair leg, no tools to return. Just her. I couldn't sleep, she said. I didn't answer. I only pulled out the stool, and she sat without protest. For a while, the only sound was the ticking of the wall clock, steady as a heartbeat neither of us wanted to acknowledge. She rubbed her hands together, restless. I don't know how we ended up here. Neither do I admitted. My voice came out rougher than I meant. Her eyes found mine, and I could see the storm in them. Guilt, longing, something older than both. She opened her mouth, then closed it, shaking her head. This isn't supposed to happen. I leaned against the counter, folding my arms to keep them from reaching for her. And yet it has. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was thick, almost tender. I felt her gaze tracing me, the same way mine traced her, hesitant, reverent, afraid of what it meant to be seen. She whispered, "I'm too old for this." "You're not too old," I said softly. "I'm just here. You're here. That's all." Her laugh was fragile, almost breaking. "You make it sound simple." "Maybe it is." She shook her head, but her body leaned forward, her elbows pressing into her knees. I noticed the fine lines at the corner of her eyes, the faint tremor in her fingers. I wanted to memorize every detail, as though they were mine to keep. Minutes passed like hours. Neither of us moved, yet everything shifted. Finally, she let her hand fall to the counter between us. Not reaching for me, not offering, just placing it there, open, waiting. I stared at it, the way her palm curved slightly, the small scar near her thumb. My chest tightened. Slowly, cautiously, I set my hand beside hers, close enough that our fingers brushed. The touch was nothing and everything. Her breath caught, but she didn't pull away. Neither did I. We stayed like that, two hands touching, barely, while the rest of the world seemed to pause. There were no declarations, no promises, just the quiet acknowledgement of something too real to deny. Her shoulders softened, the tension leaving her body piece by piece. She leaned forward until her forehead rested lightly against my temple. The closeness was unbearable and perfect, a collapse without sound. "I don't know what happens next," she whispered. "Neither do I said. And that was enough. The clock ticked on, steady and indifferent, while we sat together in silence, our hands still brushing, our breaths quietly sinking, as though the world had finally allowed us this one fragile truth. It wasn't love announced. It was love found, quiet, flawed, and undeniable. I think about that night more often than I should. Not because of what we did, but because of what we didn't. No grand confessions, no sudden declarations. Just two people sitting in a quiet shop after hours, hands brushing, both too aware of the weight of it. Looking back, I realized that was the moment I changed. Not in a way anyone else could see. Outside, I was still the same, still young, still figuring out what to do with my days. But inside, something shifted. I learned that love doesn't always arrive the way you imagine it. Sometimes it comes quietly, through tired eyes and unfinished sentences, through silence that feels louder than words. She taught me that, without even trying. I used to think she carried regret like a shadow, this constant reminder of what she had lost. And maybe she did. But somewhere between those visits, between the chair leg and the storm and the cookies she left on my counter, she let me see the part of her that still longed for something she didn't believe she deserved. And in her eyes, I think I found the reflection of myself I hadn't seen before. Someone steady, someone who could hold the silence without running from it. People ask me sometimes why I stay late at the shop. They don't know that's where I first learned what intimacy really is. Not kisses or grand gestures, but the courage to let someone sit in your presence without filling the space with noise. We never called it love out loud. Maybe we didn't need to. Maybe love is too simple a word for what we found. What we had was recognition. The quiet relief of being seen, even in your flaws, even in your exhaustion. I still hear her voice sometimes. That night she said, "You'll forget me one day." And I still remember how I answered, without even thinking, not even in my dreams. Funny thing is, I was right. I never did. Even now, the memory isn't sharp with pain or dulled with time. It's warm, like light at the end of a long day. She reminded me that some connections aren't about forever. They're about the way they change you in the moment you need it most. And I suppose that's why I'm telling you this. Because maybe you've had someone like that, someone who arrived in your life unexpectedly, left a mark without meaning to, and made you see yourself differently. If you have, then you understand. If you haven't, maybe one day you will. And when you do, you'll know what I mean when I say, sometimes the quietest moments echo the loudest. So tell me, have you ever met someone you could never forget?